Welcome to class 3 of International Humanitarian Law. My name is Spence Bollen, Spence from Seattle. Going to be presenting today with Joanne Dufour that we're talking about more about international humanitarian law, going a little bit further in depth. And as I mentioned before in our presentations, I have a degree in international studies, and I also have a background as an instructor with the American Red Cross teaching this material. But for today's purposes, we're going to be teaching as private individuals unaffiliated with the Red Cross. Okay.
And I'd like to warmly welcome you to our third class. It's been an exciting adventure, and I hope that you'll be joining us, even if you didn't get a chance to watch the other two. My name is Joanne Dufour, and I am welcoming you from Lacey, Washington. And I've been a volunteer with the Red Cross for a number of years, having joined in with the Red Cross, having taught social studies in the classroom. So this has been a wonderful experience. And this time we're going to be focusing on the international humanitarian law and the international situation that is bringing it in contact with the international courts. So, Spence, if you'd like to start our slides.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And I probably should have mentioned that I am joining from Bogota, Colombia. I am originally from Seattle, Spence from Seattle, but I currently live in Bogota, Colombia. So this is an international presentation about international issues.
Right, and the full title of this is called International Perspectives on IHL, or International Humanitarian Law, and we'll be including a war crime overview in this. We're recording this on November 22nd, and it is an addenda to Spence's program, which he presented earlier, and are online under the same title.
Okay, yeah, and these events are ever changing, so that's why it's important to keep in mind that this is a snapshot in time, and these events may have changed since we recorded and you started watching.
So what we'll be doing with this particular slideshow is talking about the International Committee of the Red Cross. That is the one, obviously, that was founded by Henri Dunant, and is focusing very, very specifically on warfare. They are the parent organization of the Red Cross movement. And in that capacity, over time, they have associated themselves with the international courts. They obviously don't do what the international courts do, but they're certainly aware because they are looking at the same situations. We'll also be focusing in on the United Nations. The ICRC is a member of the NGO community of the United Nations and works closely with them. The NGO stands for non-governmental organizations. And as we get into IHL, we'll be able to understand a little bit more fully how other NGOs cooperate with international humanitarian law. So let's see how all this unfolds. Now, one of the first things that's important to remember right now, as we're witnessing the current wars that are going on in the world, and we're specifically focusing this time around on the wars that are engaging Russia and the Ukraine, and then Israel and the Palestinian areas. And so one of the things that becomes very important is the issue of occupation. And when you look at the Geneva Convention, certainly they address the issue of occupation. So I want you to begin to think, as you're watching this, how would you explain it to someone? If you're with someone right now watching this, maybe you want to talk about that and talk about the current examples of occupied areas. You can put this on pause and do that, but we will continue with our discussion. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Now, we did say that in the handbook of the Geneva Conventions, there is a definition. And the definition that is, it is for occupation, and that is a form of armed conflict with three conditions. Now, the conditions are talking about effective control. So occupation assumes that there are two countries that are contesting an area. It's the area of the country itself, and now it's being occupied by the forces of a different government. So in that situation, there is an unconsent, a lack of consent to the fact that the foreign forces have invaded an area. In other words, the locals are not happy with the situation, but they are unable to be able to exert their own sovereignty. So there is the ability of these foreign forces to exercise authority and become the de facto government. So that is why it's important to realize that occupation is generally considered a temporary situation. What are the current examples, though, of occupied areas? Let's move on to the next slide and talk about that.
Okay. And just something that I want to mention on this one, because I know that we talked about it in the previous classes, but it bears repeating. Every country in the world has agreed to the Geneva Conventions. So this isn't just some arbitrary principle put forward by some global bureaucracy. This is a treaty that has been signed and ratified by every government in the world, and that they've agreed to abide by these definitions and these rules.
Thank you, Spence. That was a very good and helpful clarification. Now, as we move on, there are obligations that go along, and they're spelled out in the Geneva Conventions. But I want you to think about this as a question that, again, you might want to talk about with a colleague, because there are only 3 obligations here. So I want you to read through the 4 of them and find the one that is wrong, that is not an obligation. Is it maintaining their military objective? That means maintaining the military objective of the occupier and their security needs, utilizing the skills and resources for the benefit of the country that's the occupier. What about respecting the needs of the local population and allowing citizens in that local area to maintain their status quo? So obviously, because the IRC is very much concerned with citizens and citizens who might have become impacted by the warfare situation, the correct answer is going to be is B. The occupying country is not allowed, really, to utilize the skills, in other words, enslave the people that they are now occupying, or take the resources from the area and use them themselves. It is a temporary situation. They are to maintain the running of the government as the official government should be doing, but they are the ones in control. Okay, let's move on. Now, with the situation that we are facing, the International Committee of the Red Cross has made a statement about Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank since 1967. 1967, if you recall the last program that Spence did, 1967 was the year that Israel fought to obtain areas that it felt that it lost when the fighting ceased at the end of 1948. And so there was in that fighting a regaining of Gaza and the West Bank, where the Palestinians have lived. But the ICRC has stated from that time that Israel is occupying the West Bank. In other words, it was considered an area of occupation. So those conditions should be applicable the conditions that we just read, should be applicable to their treatment of people in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. And also that the treatment of the people, the civilians who are living there, must be humane. Of course, we have seen that change very drastically in the last year and a half. The ICRC has repeatedly stated that Israel's settlements policy, now the settlements policy usually pertain to the West Bank, and in that, that was designated a Palestinian land, but what was wrong, as the ICRC saw it, was that Palestinian homes were taken over, demolished, and replaced by homes for settlements. In other words, new Jewish individuals who were coming in wanting to live in Israel. So that the area that was the West Bank reduced in the size of Palestinian control over the area. And that is one of the reasons that they are violating the rules of occupation. Now, it's also very important to recognize that ICRC has never said that Israel does not have a right to defend itself and to make sure that its population is secure. But it's a question of what are you doing with the Palestinians who live there? And that's one of the issues that has been of major concern. Let us not forget that being a Red Cross, there is a Red Cross in Israel itself. That's the Magen David Adom chapter of the Red Cross. And there is a Red Cross in the areas that are Palestinian, and that's the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. And in each of those cases, they operate for the welfare of those populations. So they're perfectly aware of what's happening to those populations. And if fighting takes place, they are there to aid the suffering, as they would do in any fighting situation. Okay, let's go.
And I'll just say one quick thing, which was I can remember back when I was in college learning about some of these issues, because these obviously go back very far. And talking with someone saying, that basically throughout history, a country would invade another country and then just take its land. That you can see, all sorts of examples throughout history of particularly neighboring countries just, invading and saying, okay, this land is ours, that would be called annexation. And with the Geneva Conventions are trying to bring humanity to war. And so they're trying to set down standards and limitations that sort of action should not be allowed, and that there should not be annexation, there should not be settlements, there should not be ongoing, never-ending occupations of these territories.
Hey, thank you. Okay, now, so if there is this thing called International Humanitarian Law, which is the legislation and the Geneva Conventions that was produced by the Red Cross, we have said that there are a number of other non-governmental organizations that ascribe to the IHL. Okay, they agree with it and they help to enforce it in their own way. In 2023, there was in the United Nations a UN declaration wanting to reduce harm to civilians. Obviously, Geneva Conventions talks about distinction and proportionality and limiting unnecessary suffering. And in those cases, they're talking mostly about the civilian population, respecting the rights of the civilian population. So an NGO by the name of Insecurity Insight decided following that UN declaration to examine threats facing people living and working in dangerous environments. So a lot of these were war-torn areas. We were just talking about two, but there are a lot more war-torn areas. So they were doing some inventory, and let's look at what they found. Now, they were looking at an area which is being victimized in some way, shape, or form by explosive weapons. And they wanted to count those. And this count is only for the year 2023. All right, so this tells you how much fighting has gone on in some of these areas. The red ones show the largest areas that were impacted, so it's no surprise, but maybe it is a surprise that there were 339 incidents in 2023 alone where civilians were seriously impacted. For Ukraine, it was 41. How does this compare with, quote, the other side? Well, there were no Israeli areas that were impacted. That might also be true because of the defensive nature of their military. You know, they can in some ways, in some locations, you know, have the ability to deflect the missiles that are coming towards them, and that would not necessarily always be true of the Palestinian areas. And Russia, again, was not because of the same issue. Their population was not counted because it didn't show up. But you can see some of the other areas where fighting is going on. And those, of course, are people who are victimized by these incidents. 339 incidents affected food supply. So if you're questioning who is impacted by occupation, and where and how are they impacted? Certainly they're impacted by any humanitarian aid that is going and carrying food. And that's very, very serious impact, as we can tell with what's going on these days in Palestine. Now, one thing that is also a service of the ICRC, and it is what happens in a war when prisoners are taken in a war situation. The ICRC has routinely, since its founding, begun to visit prisoners and to make sure that prisoners of war, especially after the third convention, which primarily focused of the four conventions, Geneva Conventions, the third convention after World War I specifically focused on POWs or prisoners of war. But every single year, there's a tally of how many prisons take place. So I don't think it's widely known that the ICRC just in 2023 alone made 29,000 prison visits around the world. This does not just focus on what's going on in the current areas that we're citing. This is worldwide. But for the areas that we're citing, the ICRC was able to hand over 105 hostages taken by Hamas to Israel in exchange for the release of 240 Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. So those exchanges have gone on. There are still hostages that have not been released, but the ICRC was there to aid those that were released. So I think we give credit to the role of the ICRC that oftentimes is not recognized. Now we're still using the data that this insight group was collecting. And here they started to collect educational areas, in other words, schools and universities, which were impacted by explosive weapons. And in that case, you'll notice that there were two areas which had the most issues. Ukraine had the highest number of educational targets for that year. And Myanmar, and those of you who are not familiar with that name, that used to be Burma, had the second highest because there's fighting that's going on there as well. But by contrast, the opposition in Palestine, of course, was impacted by 68 schools. All of the universities have been impacted, and they have been non-operative since the fighting has overtaken them. And where by contrast, Israel had 3 incidents. And there were 1 incident in Russia. So you can see that they are keeping track now of the educational future for both the civilians in both of the areas where there was heavy educational bombardment. On the left-hand side, they also have noticed what's happening with health targets. Now, these are clinics and hospitals. And again, we're seeing very, very severe effects. While Ukraine and Myanmar have had the highest numbers in education, in the last 4 months alone of 2023, Israel increased its bombing on health facilities so that there were 112 incidences of hospitals or health clinics that were targeted. As of May, the World Health Organization has documented that in the West Bank alone, there were 480 attacks on healthcare. And this is obviously the civilians have been devastated by these conditions. And so we're just looking at the comparative effects on the citizenry of the countries that we were focusing on tonight.
And I just want to, I mean, I know we kind of did this presentation before, and it's like shocking, the West Bank, that, this isn't Gaza that's being mentioned in the statistic, but the West Bank, which is, a separate entity, a separate geography. So yeah, just to
Well, I
highlight
think
that.
that's included under I think they incorporated the West Bank and Gaza under what they're calling Palestine at this point. I think they added the two together. And
Oh, okay.
yeah. And
Yeah.
because they have a separate accounting for Lebanon there as not, and this is 2023. Now we don't know, since Lebanon has been under attack by Israel, we don't know what the 2024 numbers are yet.
Yeah. No, it's shocking.
Okay, now we're getting into the area, so what? So this fighting and all this devastation is going on. Isn't anybody trying to stop it? Well, there have been efforts of trying to bring countries to task and stop their fighting. There have been incidents where there are the courts at work, trying to see if people that are ordering the fighting are breaking the laws and will get their a fair treatment in a court. So these are what the international courts are for. And they hear cases in which one party may be a state or international organization or a body thereof, and they have their own independent judges. Now, there are the large world courts, and then there are international courts, which are smaller courts for specific regions. For example, courts from Sierra Leone or courts from Yugoslavia. So we'll explain those as we go on. But this is a broad definition of what an international court does. Now, the older international court was originally founded in The Hague, and it was Queen Juliana who, at the end of the 1800s, really felt that if countries could just get together and talk to each other and resolve their conflicts peacefully, that would be a much preferred future for the world. So there was a court, a tribunal court that was set up to do that. And it did operate not all that effectively because we landed up going to war for World War I and World War II. But when the United Nations was formed, that court, which was still operating, was incorporated into the UN system, and it became its legal court, so that all members of the United Nations are members. And this court, the name was changed and became the International Court of Justice. And that is still operating in The Hague, and they're still using this beautiful building to hear cases. Now, the distinction with the ICJ is that it is a court to which governments are able to bring their cases against other governments. And that has, in cases, successfully stopped fighting. And that's what we were hoping, that more countries would go to the courts to resolve their conflicts. And we'll see in their history that this was even tried recently. Let's go on and explain that. So this International Court of Justice, as we said, it's between states. It's the only international court that takes disputes between countries and sees it as its focus to resolve those difficulties. And as I mentioned, that it became the UN, under the UN system after the 1945 Charter was created. Now let's look at how this applies more specifically. The International Court of Justice gives opinions on current warring situations. And one of the opinions that they stated is states must never make civilians the object of attack. Now that's exactly what the humanitarian law says. And so they came out strongly in favor of humanitarian law, and must consequently never use weapons that are incapable of distinguishing between civilian and military targets. This was oftentimes interpreted as outlawing nuclear weapons, though they didn't deliberately say that when they came out with this decision. But it's been interesting that the ICJ has been conducting an investigation of Russia's actions in Ukraine following the time that the and I'll give you the background on this, because there was an appeal that was made by Russia to the International Court of Justice to ask them to assess a state of genocide that they felt was going on in the Russian territories that were controlled by Ukraine. And after this decision was rendered by the ICJ, and Russia resorted to war, President Zelensky appealed to the ICJ to maintain contact as the war went on. So let's see what happened. Now, this is interesting background that I don't think a lot of people know. That Russia's stated purpose for invading Ukraine was to prevent genocide. That's the reason that they gave when they began its incursion, its military incursion into Ukraine. But Ukraine turned around and went to the ICJ after it was attacked and sued it for its invasion. Both of the countries were talking about genocide because both of the countries had signed the treaty on genocide, and so it was a perfectly logical way that if you sign it, you're supposed to enforce it. So each of those countries were saying they aren't enforcing it, either against us or against part of us. With, in the case of Ukraine, the Russian areas under Ukrainian control. So the court did rule that it would consider whether Ukraine committed genocide, but it would not rule on whether Russia's invasions violated the Genocide Convention. But remember, because Russia started by going to the ICJ first. But after the invasion, the court ordered Russia to immediately suspend military operations. They did not authorize the fact that they proceeded with military actions in Ukraine. So that order obviously was ignored. But the tallying of war crimes, which is something that the ICJ can look at, that actually started and has been both ICJ and International Criminal Court, which we'll talk about next, have both been involved in looking at the situations and seeing whether or not they can make helpful decisions to bring the warring parties to an end.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in there that the UN Charter makes clear that countries can only go to war and legitimately go to war under certain circumstances. One of those is self-defense, such as being invaded. And another is if the Security Council of the United Nations authorizes the use of military force within a specific area. And so both with the United States invasion of Iraq And with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people point to that UN charter and those specific conditions for sort of saying that this is why this is illegal, that there isn't sufficient grounds to justify military action.
Thank you. Now, this is the other more exciting and more specific court. After Rwanda and the genocide that occurred there, and after Yugoslavia and the genocide that occurred there, especially in Bosnia, and there was talk about, because they found that there were individuals that you could hold responsible for actions ordering the killing of civilians and entering into obviously war crime activities. So the International Criminal Court was created where you can try the individual, not the government, but the individual. And I can remember if that had actually been in effect when we were so angry at what Saddam Hussein was doing, and we chose to invade Iraq as a country, were the times different, you could take Saddam Hussein to the International Criminal Court and avoided all the trauma that the Iraqi citizens had to go through because of that war. So that's the hope for the future, that if you can stop the actions by bringing charges against the individuals, that is a curb to actually involving fighting against the citizens of a country. So this is a new building that was built in The Hague because The Hague housed the other court. So this was a logical place, and Netherlands was perfectly happy to afford this space to this other court as well. So this the Rome Statute was introduced by 2020 in 1998. By 2002, it had officially started to operate. And it operated without a building, but the building finally got built. And so I think the building was built by about 2012. And it has been operating since that time at The Hague. Now let's see how this International Criminal Court works, because now you're talking about identifying crimes that individuals have committed as individuals. And it usually is the person who is responsible for conducting the action. So the first crime that they identify is this crime of genocide. There is a separate convention that tells you that genocide is illegal, but this is telling you if you find someone that has ordered genocide, that individual can be brought to the court. So you're deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now that word has been thrown around much more recently as the numbers of dead on the Palestinian side have risen so dramatically. And so the question was still being decided by the court. Is this genocide? And if so, is someone responsible for ordering the genocide? So let's see what happened. But first, we want to see what are the other conditions that the court is responsible for administering. And so we'll see the other three items besides genocide. The second item is something called crimes against humanity. And these are serious violations committed as part of a large-scale attack against any civilian population. So if you're murdering, torturing, or deporting people, that can be a crime against humanity. As people were being moved around and forced to move around because they're being threatened, or were actually being deported, those would be grounds for action by the court. The third are war crimes, which are now, again, this is a connection between the IHL and the international courts. If there are violations that are in contradiction to the Geneva Conventions, those cases can again be brought to the ICC. And the fourth is a crime of aggression. And that was the hardest one to define. It took a couple years after the court came into being for this crime to be identified. But there are issues now where this is the crime that has been committed and identified for individuals. Let's see some progress here. What's happening with these court cases? But let's first look at what a war crime is. And so just to be very, very specific, a war crime is willful killing, the administration of torture, willfully causing great suffering, extensive destruction and appropriation of property carried out unlawfully against civilian instructions. Let's recall those health clinics and the educational clinics that we cited. The taking of hostages, we have seen that in the current war. Willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protected persons of the rights of air and regular trial. How well are those prisoners being treated who have been taken? Compelling a protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power. We haven't necessarily seen that where people are actually forced to serve in the army of the occupier. But let's progress. So the ICC now has made a statement to identify war criminals from Israel and Hamas. This decision got distributed on May 20th of this year, and the people who are in the Middle East war, the people that were cited were the Prime Minister himself and the Minister of Defense. And the charges that they were using were the charges included the starvation of the civilians, willfully causing great suffering, willfully killing, intentional attacks against the civilian population, extermination, murder, and persecution. So they were taking out of those four conditions the charges that they were particularly saying these two men were responsible for. There were 3 individuals from Hamas that were also cited, and they were for similar charges: extermination, murder, hostage taking, rape, and other acts of sexual violence, torture, and cruel treatment. But this week there was news beyond the definition that these individuals were indicted, because first comes the indictment, then comes an arrest warrant. So let's see what happened. Matter of fact, it happened yesterday. Okay, this is yesterday's news. The International Criminal Court issued those arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, 2 of the men that we said they had been indicted. But now the arrest warrant is out. So if they show up in any country that is a member of the International Criminal Court, any judge in that country can arrest them. So there are 124 members of the International Criminal Court. And so for Mr. Netanyahu, now it's important to remember that the court has already indicted, and they have an arrest order for President Putin. And that was issued last year. And that was the first issue that went out before for the Russian action. The Russian action is older than the, as we know, than the Middle East action. So the courts have been acting. Now, they do not have a police force that can bring in individuals to the court. They are usually depending on the members of the court themselves to actually bring those individuals to the court if they show up in their jurisdiction. And that's and we'll talk a little bit more about what universal jurisdiction is about. But it is interesting now that these arrest warrants are available so that judges can take, or heads of state can take action on them. Now we're slipping back to the International Court of Justice. Remember, that's the one that makes decisions about governments themselves. So they have identified that Israel's occupation and annexation of the Gaza are illegal. are unlawful. And so why is that important? Because they are actually saying they must give up those properties. They cannot maintain those properties under occupation. They have used the excuse of occupation for too long now, since 67, and it is illegal. So it's discriminatory laws and policies against Palestinians that have violated the prohibition on racial segregation and apartheid. So with that in mind, South Africa, that has had, of course, apartheid to deal with, they have taken a case against Israel, and they are suing Israel for genocide because they are saying genocide is established. And this is a unique situation for a country of the South that had its own very serious history of disturbances within their country, that they are taking this action on behalf of the civilians who they felt have been killed by genocide. So this was a court order that was issued in January of this year. And there hasn't been no decisions now, except that they are investigating this. The ICJ is investigating this, but they haven't reached a decision yet as to what action they will take. So this is how there's a different, you're holding the whole government of Israel responsible, not only the individuals. So both courts are operating in these wars, which is an important thing to notice.
Yeah, and like multiple court cases, both within the ICC and within the ICJ, moving in parallel at the same time. In the last class I presented, we talked about Rafah, and that was part of the ICJ case from South Africa regarding genocide, that South Africa asserted that the assault on the town of Rafah in southern Gaza constituted an immediate threat of genocide. And the court did issue an order saying that Israel could not proceed with the assault on Rafah as it had currently planned. So there have been some decisions along the way pointing at the court at the very least being concerned, but certainly taking this as a serious issue under consideration.
Yes, thank you. Now, when it comes to the ICC again, we did mention what was going on in the Middle East, especially with the with the arrest warrants that just came out. But let's talk about what action the ICC has taken against Russia. Remember, Russia's stated purpose for invading Ukraine was to prevent genocide, right? And that's how this whole issue started, right? And then from Russia's point of view, it escalated into war. But the ICC has had an investigating team in the Ukraine gathering evidence on the war crimes which have been committed since the war began. So arrest warrants against 6 individuals, including the Russian president, on charges of war crimes for reasons of damage to civilian areas and crimes against humanity. You can see what they're specifying there, of the four options that they have been issued. There have been over 50,000 cases of war crimes to date under review, including crimes committed by both sides. Many of these cases are being handled by the Ukrainian courts themselves, but it just shows you how devastating these wars have been, that so many cases of war crimes have been committed. I don't think there probably has been a similar, for the space of time that these actions have occurred, I don't think there's been a similar event going on in history. Now, we said that the other agency that's operating universally and how they relate to the United Nations and how the ICRC relates to them is important. We already mentioned that ICRC is a member of the non-governmental organization and has a permanent seat in that capacity at the UN. But when it comes to war and peace issues, well, the role of the United Nations, war and peace issues are under the jurisdiction of the Security Council, and their job initially was really to prevent war. not all that successfully, but what they keep on trying to do is to bring the contested parties together whenever there is a war and conflict and see what are the grounds by which that war could come to an end. And then the Security Council members will try to see if they can proceed towards that resolution. One of the problems that has occurred is that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council also have a veto power, which means that they can stop the progress. For example, there was just yesterday, I believe, there was a resolution that was, no, earlier this week, there was a resolution to bring about a ceasefire. And it was a ceasefire that they wanted to take place in Israel and Palestinian areas. And that was something that the United States used its veto power, and it was the only country in the Security Council to vote against that. All other 14 members of the Security Council voted for that. There have been times that the Russians have done the same thing in case there was a ceasefire that was a resolution against Russia. So all the countries have it at one time or another, but Russia and the United States, I think, take the record for having the most vetoes. The issue usually, if there's no resolution because of the use of a veto, oftentimes the issue will enter into the General Assembly. Now, there's no veto power. Every country in all 193 members of the United Nations are members of the General Assembly, and they all have equal voice and vote. So what you do is you get a response to something that might have occurred in the Security Council, now appearing for discussion in the General Assembly. And because there's no veto, you can get the reaction to the countries of the world on an issue and who is for or against whatever is being proposed. So this is a very effective way. These resolutions do not, resolutions become part of international law, but the resolutions are not legally binding, where the resolutions of the Security Council are legally binding. So these resolutions, they frequently have cited violations of IHL, so they're working in cooperation with the Geneva Conventions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they can take action. And some action could be like creating a peacekeeping force that might be used in a situation, especially once the fighting has stopped. But they need somebody to make sure that the sides don't continue the fighting. And that's what peacekeeping is about. But peacekeeping comes from, that's the power of the Security Council to do that. So an example of something that didn't pass the Security Council, but it did pass the International Court of Justice in September of this year.
Oh, you mean the General Assembly, I think.
Oh, yes, okay. The General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for the end within a year to Israel's unlawful presence in the West Bank and Gaza, because the ICJ had just issued what we just talked about previously. So you'll see that they are supporting that, even though members of the Security Council might not agree.
Yeah. And one thing that's, I mean, maybe it's someone, who has a degree in international relations, interesting, but I think it is interesting, even for somebody who doesn't, dive too deep into these issues, is just to look at who votes within the General Assembly, yay or nay on these resolutions about Israel, because there have been many resolutions calling for justice in the West Bank and Gaza, that there were, 160 countries that voted in favor of the resolution, 30 countries that abstained, and Israel, the United States, and like 3 island nations in the Pacific voted against. And so just looking at that lopsided, that even U.S. allies like France and Great Britain Germany, that oftentimes they will look at some of these issues and say, either we're going to abstain or we're going to vote in favor of international law and upholding these international norms.
Thank you. So ICRC wants to protect people, right? And we spent time in spelling that out. So who is protected? Well, obviously civilians, right? And the military, if they are sick or wounded, they are not protected because they're the ones that conduct the combat. And so they are able to kill, or they might be victims of killing, and that is legal. However, if they are taken as prisoners of war or any persons deprived of their freedom, they now are protected. Persons who accompany the armed forces without actually being members of the armed forces, like civilians who might be handling the laundry, or they might be preparing all the food, war correspondents, supply contractors, those people are protected because they are not engaging in the actual fighting. Military, medical, and religious personnel are protected. Members of merchant marine and civil aircraft are protected. Pilots are protected if they are not necessarily military pilots. Red Cross and other relief personnel. So you'll notice who is not on this list. And it's obviously going to be the combatants themselves, because the combatants themselves are authorized to conduct the war. And to be able to determine what is a military necessity, recognizing that they also have to uphold the principles of distinction and proportionality and limit unnecessary suffering. So that's the mix of responsibilities there. And what is protected? Well, let us recall what some of the damage has done that was recorded by the NGO, who was looking at the areas that had undergone some military conflict. So civilian property is protected. That means individual housing. We have certainly seen that violated in the killing that is going on, or the bombing that is going on. Medical facilities, we cited that. They are protected, but that has not been acknowledged. Cultural and historical sites, well, they have been protected in the past, and we're not sure in this case if they are fully protected, oftentimes not. Religious facilities as well. Objects indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. There you're talking about electrical plants or nuclear power plants or dams, or those kind of objects. Works containing dangerous forces. Again, that would be most likely like a nuclear power plant. And the natural environment. If you've got a beautiful, the Grand Canyon, if you've got places that are just exquisite on the earth, those would be protected. So I'm asking you, how many of these areas have you seen in the news from Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, West Bank, or Lebanon in the past? Unfortunately, too many.
Yeah. And an interesting nuance to this is that these are protected areas. But as we talked about, both in the first class and in the last class, we have the four fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. And the principle of military necessity states that if function, say like an apartment building or a medical facility is being used as a military site, that it can lose that protection. And we can also see that under distinction, that it would be, according to both the, norms of just humanity, which is kind of what this all boils back to, but also within the principles of international humanitarian law, medical facilities should not be used as bases of operations for military. But if they do, they lose that protection that's given through distinction, that's given through a variety of these. And yeah, like I know that I just had like a lot of conversation with friends and family about this. Um, and what I always come back to is proportionality. And Joanne and I have talked about this too, that just because you have someone shooting rockets from a hospital doesn't mean that you can bomb the entire hospital to kill that one person shooting rockets.
Yeah, and these are very, very difficult situations because of what uh, Spence was bringing up. And so it's always the responsibility of the JAG officer to help the commander to reach, is what we're planning to do too much? And is it a reasonable expectation? And those are all, and remember, the person who decides on the action is held responsible. So if it's a war crime and it is ultimately assessed as a wartime, that individual can be brought to the ICC. So these are very realistic situations, and they're not easy. And that's why you have 50,000 cases that are being investigated of war crimes. And it's oftentimes a question of degree,
Hmm.
like the examples of, how many people are we talking about if a combatant is a low-level combatant, but he's really a target for somebody and he's at a social event, do you go ahead and kill other civilians that are at the social event to get this person or not? But if it's a high enough level person, then maybe they will risk the lives or take the lives of civilians as collateral damage because it's a high level person. So these are all situations that might be similar, but it's a question of degree that somebody has to decide. War is not easy.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just like on the slide, it looks so clear cut, these are protected. And then
Mhm.
we like, put the asterisk, um, and it all gets a lot more complicated. So,
Yep. So these are some of the current considerations of some Russian war crimes in the Ukraine. And these were the conditions under which the people indicted have been charged. So it's massacres of civilians and soldiers, indiscriminate attacks, attacking critical civilian infrastructure, bombing hospitals and shelters, tortures, rape and sexual enslavement of women and children, and stealing children. It's like the nighttime news is just filled with this stuff. And so it becomes a question of what happens now and where's the impunity and who's held responsible. And so that's going to be the next step once the fighting stops. Now, how else can war crimes be adjudicated? Well, district courts within a country, we mentioned that Ukrainian courts are handling some of the war crimes. It depends on who's committing the crime and what level are they, what level of rank are they. But this principle of universal jurisdiction is an important principle because it's the states claim criminal jurisdiction over persons whose alleged grave breaches of crimes were committed outside the boundaries of the prosecuting state. So you do not, if you are a judge in an area and some person, like someone who has an arrest warrant over their head, comes waltzing into your territory, even though they didn't come from, they're not a citizen of your country, you have every authority to be able to apprehend that person. And that's something that the judges worldwide are entitled to that. And so that's the reason that we hope that the wheels will move more efficiently and we can hold people responsible for crimes they have committed so they'd stop committing the crimes. So universal jurisdiction is the principle that every country has an interest in bringing to justice the perpetrators of grave crimes. And so that's essentially the way that they're hoping that they will be saving civilian lives in the process, rather than having to bomb locations where you suspect other military are located. So the Ukraine and Palestine are not the only areas in the world experiencing war crimes. So the ICRC is a pretty busy outfit. because they're trying, and so are the two international courts. So we just gave you a glimpse of how they might be useful and realize all the networking that's going on between these countries and these courts that we selected tonight, but realizing there are lots more work to be done in addressing the other. I think there are about 40 current episodes of warfare going on in the world. So we got a lot of work to do to make this a more peaceful place. There are 124 countries that are current members of the International Criminal Court, but there are situations where the countries that we're very much concerned about, like ours, as well as some of the actors we spoke about today, you'll see they are listed as signatories, which have not yet ratified, but sometimes they decided that they were going to sign the treaty and they were going to investigate whether they would ratify it, and instead they decided to unsign it. That's exactly what we did. President Clinton, on his last day in office, signed to join the International Criminal Court. Mr. Bush, on his first day in office, unsigned it. So we had a about face there. Russia did the same thing. Russia signed and withdrew. Israel did the same thing. It signed and withdrew. So did the Ukraine, but the Ukraine signed it and just recently decided that they were going to ratify it. So they're waiting for the period of ratification. But they will be official members of the International Criminal Court, probably because the International Criminal Court has been there investigating the war crimes. And President Zelensky has had a lot of contact with them. So South Africa signed and withdrew. These other these other areas, now, there's no reason that China is all alone by itself, except we couldn't get it to obey the printing here. But China, together with India, Indonesia, Iraq, Lebanon, Malaysia, Nepal, Pakistan, South Sudan, and Turkey, have not yet even signed it. So there is more work to do to get this universally accepted and cooperatively engaged in, so that maybe we can make this world a better place to live in.
And why would a country not want to be a part of the ICC?
Well, we would say that we wanted to protect American soldiers, and so we are concerned that our American soldiers have on occasion committed war crimes. And so we don't want them indicted. And that has been our position. I think other countries might say the same thing, because you have to face up to. Now, in our case, if there were war crimes and they were, our military should be handling those crimes themselves. But if an area does not handle the crime themselves, and there have been times that we didn't handle the crime that was committed, then the ICC can step in if you sign that can happen. And so there would be times that if we do have individuals in our armed services who committed war crimes and we did not prosecute them, and there was not military action taken in the military tribunals that we hold, then it's the country where the war crime was committed might bring it to the World Court. I mean the ICC, the International Criminal Court.
Oh,
so we want to
that's the last one.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. We want to thank you very much for your time and your effort to be with us. We hope this was helpful for you, and we hope that that you can lend your support to areas that you see fitting and help others to understand that there are wheels that are turning, but this is a tough world that we live in, and we're trying to see if we can end war and live in peace. So it's that our major goal.
And also say that I think that after, something like this, it can seem, frustrating. What is there, happening, what is being done. And hopefully we've shown you a bit about, what's being done, with the United Nations, with the International Court of Justice. with International Criminal Court, but just educating yourself and being able to bring these concepts of the four Geneva Conventions, of the world courts into your conversations, that is a change in the world that we need. That we need people to be talking about international humanitarian law, and we need people to be understanding what that means and how that applies. And so, just by attending this presentation and educating yourself, you've made a step in the right direction and a step towards making things better.
And we thank you for that.
Thank you.